I want to point out a couple of differences between depraved heart murder and involuntary manslaughter under gross negligence, if you put them side by side. The first is the gravity of the risk. In involuntary manslaughter, we spoke of a substantial and unjustifiable risk. In depraved heart murder, we're speaking of conduct that endangers human life. They sound similar, but one is really worse than the other. The second is that depraved heart murder behavior is different. It's not ordinary, everyday conduct that's done badly, done with gross negligence. It's behavior that has no place in our society. It's behavior that has no redeeming value. You fall asleep at the wheel like Conrad did, and maybe you're going to be charged with involuntary manslaughter because you had nodded off 4 to 5 times. But if you fall asleep at the wheel because you're crashing from a high on drugs and you hadn't slept all night and you were speeding when you fell asleep, now we might turn that falling asleep at the wheel into murder too. We might see the gravity of the risk is worse, and we might see that this is base antisocial behavior. Another difference between the two crimes is whether defendant has to know of the risk. In involuntary manslaughter, the test is whether defendant knew or should have known about the substantial and unjustifiable risk. That means the defendant is culpable if he's aware of the risk, but it also means that even if he's not aware of the risk personally, he can still go to prison if average people understood the risk. That's what the should have part of the test means. Should he have known, like the rest of society? Should he have known that he was engaging in behavior that has substantial and unjustifiable risk? So either defendant knew or he should have known. I sometimes joke that one can go to prison for involuntary manslaughter for being stupid. Saying, I didn't know of the risk, it won't work as a defense. Murder too is different. Because the sentence and the punishment is so steep for murder, where a defendant may be going to prison for life, society wants to make sure that there's a subjective test requirement, that the defendant also knew of this extreme risk, not just that an average person would have known it. Prosecution's got to show that defendant himself knew of that risk. So you might be thinking, well, any defendant could walk into court and say, I didn't know of the risk. True, but just because a defendant testifies to that doesn't mean that a jury's going to believe him. It's equal likely that a jury will think the following. What do you mean you didn't know? It's such common knowledge. How couldn't you know it? I don't believe you. I think you were aware that you were endangering others. I don't believe you. I think you're lying. So as a recap, the elements for depraved heart murder are threefold. First, that an average person would know that the conduct endangers human life in general. That is what we call the objective test. Remember, it doesn't mean that a death is going to happen or will happen, only that it could happen. Second, we focus on the nature of the activity, and we ask whether it was a base antisocial act, devoid of any socially redeeming value, or maybe it was done with base antisocial motive, an animus. This makes the behavior pointedly different from that which would be ordinary negligence for torts or gross negligence for involuntary manslaughter. It's conduct that if we ran that desert island, we would never allow. Finally, element number 3 demands the defendant knew the conduct endangers human life as much as an average person does.